The disappearance of Mekayla Bali begins in a space where nothing appears broken at first glance. Morning in Yorkton, Saskatchewan carries its usual rhythm, the kind of calm that convinces everyone that life is predictable. Yet in cases like this, stability is often only a surface effect, hiding shifts that no one recognizes until it is already too late. In small communities like Yorkton, familiarity creates a psychological illusion of safety. People believe they can recognize danger because they recognize faces, streets, and routines. This belief often weakens vigilance. On that day in 2016, nothing about the environment suggested an exception to that rule, and that is precisely what makes the case so difficult to understand. Before we move deeper into the darker layers of this case, if you find value in following these investigations, you can like, share, and subscribe to stay connected with more stories like this. Sometimes, the only way to piece together what was lost is to keep the conversation alive, so feel free to leave your thoughts and comments as we continue. Mekayla Bali was 16 years old at the time of her disappearance in Yorkton, Saskatchewan, a stage of life defined by rapid emotional change and ongoing identity formation. Adolescence often involves shifting perception, mood variability, and evolving decision-making patterns that are not always visible to parents, teachers, or peers, even when daily routines appear normal from the outside. According to early reporting and accounts from those who knew her, Mekayla was generally described as outgoing, socially capable, and able to form connections with peers, yet also someone who occasionally became withdrawn or emotionally distant. This combination is not unusual in teenagers, but in behavioral analysis, it can indicate an internal struggle between seeking connection and managing private emotional complexity. From a psychological perspective, such duality reflects the developmental tension between external presentation and internal experience, where a young person may appear stable in public interactions while privately processing stress or uncertainty. In Mekayla's case, this gap between outward behavior and inner state is important because it shapes how her movements and choices leading up to her disappearance are later interpreted. Like many teenagers, Mekayla carried aspirations extending beyond her immediate environment and daily structure. Small towns often feel limiting at that age, creating psychological tension between present reality and imagined future possibilities. This tension does not explain disappearance, but it shapes how emotional pressure and decision-making are experienced internally over time. On the surface, there was no confirmed crisis that clearly marked the beginning of her disappearance. No documented event indicated immediate danger or confrontation in her life. Instead, what exists is a gradual fragmentation of routine, where a normal school day slowly shifts into less structured movement across familiar public environments. Yorkton itself plays a key role in understanding perception failure within this case. In environments where serious crime is rare, collective awareness of risk tends to decrease over time. People begin interpreting unusual behavior as temporary or harmless because their reference point is shaped by long periods of stability and predictability. Mekayla Bali's family, like many families with teenagers, experienced ordinary patterns of adolescence that included concern, daily conversations, and occasional disagreements. These interactions were part of normal household dynamics rather than evidence of severe conflict. From all available reporting, there is no indication of a destabilizing family crisis immediately preceding her disappearance. In investigative analysis, this absence of confirmed major conflict is important because hindsight can distort interpretation of ordinary tension into perceived warning signs. When a case remains unresolved, fragmented memories and partial records are often reassembled into narratives that appear clearer than reality. In Mekayla's case, certainty cannot be reliably constructed from incomplete emotional snapshots. Friends later recalled that she sometimes expressed feelings of wanting to escape pressure or disappear from expectations. These statements are common in adolescent communication and often reflect emotional overload rather than literal intent. However, in investigative psychology, they still function as relevant behavioral indicators that cannot be fully dismissed. Importantly, there is no verified evidence that Mekayla planned to leave or vanish on that specific day. Investigators are left instead with fragmented observations that fail to form a coherent or continuous narrative. This fragmentation represents one of the most persistent challenges in missing persons analysis and behavioral reconstruction. As the morning progressed, Mekayla's movements shifted away from expected routines toward public commercial environments. These spaces are psychologically complex because they combine anonymity with visibility within the same physical structure. For adolescents experiencing uncertainty, they can create temporary freedom without stable social boundaries. Witness accounts place her in and around a shopping center, moving through different areas without a clearly documented purpose or direction. This type of behavior is not inherently suspicious, but it indicates a transition state in decision making. Choices become less anchored to routine expectations and more responsive to immediate environmental stimuli. At no point in the available record is there a confirmed moment of visible distress observed by multiple independent witnesses. This absence is significant because many disappearances include at least one observable disruption. Here, however, the transition appears smooth and almost imperceptible, complicating later interpretation of events significantly. What makes this case psychologically unsettling is not only the disappearance itself, but the absence of a defined breaking point. There is no universally agreed moment where normal behavior clearly ends and abnormal circumstance begins. Instead, there is a gradual thinning of presence within an otherwise ordinary environment. This thinning of presence creates a retrospective distortion in perception and analysis. Investigators and observers are forced to reconstruct continuity from incomplete fragments of information. In such conditions, interpretation becomes as important as fact, because facts alone cannot restore missing temporal connections or emotional context. By the end of that morning, Mekayla Bali was no longer traceable within the expected social and physical framework of her daily life. The structure that normally anchors a person's visibility had dissolved without a clearly identifiable external trigger. What remains is absence, and in this case, absence behaves like a presence of its own. In missing persons investigations, the final hours are never just about time. They are about structure, behavior, and the invisible transitions between normal life and irreversible absence. In the case of Mekayla Bali, the timeline does not collapse suddenly. It dissolves slowly, almost clinically, as if the record of her presence is being eroded rather than interrupted. On the morning of April 12, 2016, Mekayla is believed to have started her day in a way that did not immediately raise concern. She was still within the expected structure of school life, still visible within the system that defines routine teenage movement. At this stage, nothing formally suggested deviation, only the ordinary flow of a day that would later become significant in hindsight. As the day progressed, her movements shifted toward Yorkton's shopping center, a space that often functions as a psychological midpoint between obligation and autonomy. Here, individuals are physically present but socially unanchored, moving through environments without fixed expectations. For adolescents, this type of space can feel like temporary control over an otherwise structured life. Inside that environment, Mekayla was reportedly seen moving between different stores and common areas. These movements did not appear frantic or visibly distressed. Instead, they suggest a pattern of waiting or searching, as if she was oriented towards something or someone not immediately visible to outside observers. This ambiguity is what later complicates interpretation. At the same time, fragments of communication activity were recorded. Short interactions, messages, and possible contact with multiple individuals create a fragmented digital footprint. However, these fragments do not form a coherent narrative. They behave more like disconnected signals rather than a continuous conversation, making it difficult to establish intent or direction. From a behavioral perspective, this fragmentation is significant. When communication becomes irregular in short time spans, it often reflects either emotional instability or external interference in decision-making processes. In Mekayla's case, investigators are left without confirmation of which interpretation is more accurate, only the pattern itself. As the afternoon continued, the timeline becomes increasingly unstable. Witness recollections do not always align, and reported sightings vary in detail and timing. This does not necessarily indicate deception. Human memory, especially in public environments, is highly susceptible to distortion when attention is divided or when events appear routine at the time of observation. What emerges instead is a gradual breakdown of certainty. Mekayla is still present in fragments of observation, but not in a continuous, traceable path. This is a critical psychological threshold in disappearance cases, where presence no longer guarantees visibility in a meaningful, investigative sense. Then comes the critical moment, the point where all structured observation fails to maintain continuity. Within the shopping center environment, there is a brief window in which Mekayla is no longer accounted for in any confirmed public sighting. Importantly, there is no recorded disturbance associated with this transition. There are no verified reports of struggle, no audible alert, and no immediate indication that a disappearance has occurred in real time. Instead, what remains is absence without sensory confirmation. This type of disappearance is particularly difficult to reconstruct because it lacks the typical markers that anchor investigative timelines. People nearby did not immediately register that a disappearance had taken place. This delay in recognition is crucial. In crowded environments, the assumption of presence often overrides the need for active awareness. Individuals are seen only when attention is directed toward them, not continuously tracked as discrete points of human risk. By the time concern begins to surface, Mekayla has already moved outside the expected boundaries of her known routine. At home, her absence becomes noticeable as scheduled return times pass without contact. Initially, this is interpreted through familiar psychological frameworks of adolescence, including delay, distraction, or voluntary temporary absence. However, as time progresses without communication, concern shifts into uncertainty. The family initiates contact with familiar institutions, including the school, attempting to reconstruct her last known movements. At this stage, there is still no confirmation of danger, only the absence of confirmation that she is safe. As evening approaches, the uncertainty intensifies. Law enforcement becomes involved, and the situation transitions from a personal concern to a formal missing persons case. This shift changes the psychological weight of the event, as ambiguity is replaced by structured investigation, even though no physical evidence has yet emerged. What makes this phase particularly unsettling is the lack of contradiction. There is no clear evidence pointing in any specific direction. Instead, there is only silence, and silence in investigative contexts is not neutral. It creates space for competing interpretations to develop without constraint. As investigators review early accounts, inconsistencies begin to appear. Witness statements do not fully align regarding timing or location. Some descriptions suggest brief observations that may or may not correspond to Mekayla. These inconsistencies are common in fast-moving public environments, but become significant when no physical evidence is available. Certain communications attributed to her during this period also raise interpretive challenges. It remains unclear whether these interactions were initiated by Mekayla directly or influenced by external factors. In missing persons psychology, this distinction is critical because it separates voluntary movement from potential coercion. At the same time, individuals within her known social environment are reviewed for possible relevance. However, no definitive behavioral evidence emerges to strongly implicate any single person. The lack of strong indicators forces investigators to remain in a state of analytical suspension, unable to confirm or eliminate key possibilities. Then comes the most disturbing element of the timeline. Some digital and surveillance-related data suggest that activity associated with Mekayla may have continued beyond the point where she was last reliably observed in public. However, gaps in recorded surveillance create discontinuity in verification. Certain cameras and monitoring systems show missing or incomplete data during a critical time window. This absence of data is not proof of interference, but it introduces uncertainty into an otherwise already fragmented timeline. In investigations, missing information can be as significant as recorded evidence when it occurs at precise intervals. This raises a critical psychological and investigative question about the nature of Mekayla Bali's disappearance. If her movements continued beyond the last confirmed sighting, then the event may not represent a single moment of loss, but a gradual, guided transition through unseen steps. This shifts interpretation from sudden disappearance toward a potentially controlled sequence of displacement and interaction. In every missing persons case, there is a moment when uncertainty stops being emotional and becomes procedural. For Mekayla Bali, That transition begins when the investigation moves from concern into structure. Police begin mapping her last known locations, focusing on the shopping center and surrounding areas where her presence was last partially confirmed. The early stages of the investigation are defined by urgency, but also by limitation. Officers rely on witness accounts, partial surveillance data, and fragmented timelines. In cases like this, the absence of immediate physical evidence creates a vacuum where interpretation must temporarily replace confirmation. That vacuum often determines the direction of the entire case. Initial searches concentrate on retracing possible routes she may have taken. However, early inconsistencies in data collection lead to missed opportunities. Surveillance systems are reviewed, but not all footage is preserved or retrieved in time. These gaps are not always dramatic errors, but in hindsight, they become critical fractures in the investigative structure. As days pass, the lack of physical evidence becomes increasingly significant in shaping the direction of the investigation. No personal belongings are recovered in a manner that clearly indicates movement, intent, or destination. In cases like this, objects often serve as psychological anchors, and without them, the narrative loses its grounding in physical reality. Without those anchors, the timeline remains suspended in a fragile state of uncertainty. Investigators are left reconstructing events from incomplete fragments that fail to align into a unified sequence. Each piece of information exists in isolation, carrying potential meaning, yet refusing to converge into a single, coherent explanation of what actually occurred. At this stage, the case begins to shift outward into public awareness. Media coverage expands rapidly, transforming Mekayla's disappearance from a local investigation into a national point of attention. The story no longer belongs only to investigators and family. It becomes part of a broader social conversation. Public perception begins to diverge into competing theories. Some believe she may have been abducted by an unknown individual, taking advantage of a vulnerable moment. Others suggest voluntary disappearance, interpreting gaps in the timeline as signs of personal choice rather than external force. Neither theory is supported by definitive evidence, yet both gain traction. As speculation increases, the psychological pressure on the family intensifies. They are placed in a position where grief is experienced publicly rather than privately. Every new theory forces them to confront possibilities without confirmation, creating emotional strain that extends beyond the investigative process itself. In parallel, investigators begin reviewing individuals within Mekayla's social environment and those present in the vicinity of her last known location. These early suspect considerations are broad rather than targeted, reflecting the lack of a clear evidentiary foundation. At this stage, suspicion is procedural, not accusatory. Despite this review, no individual emerges with a clear and verifiable motive supported by physical evidence. Some statements contain inconsistencies, but inconsistency alone does not establish criminal involvement. In investigative psychology, ambiguity in testimony is common, especially under stress or time distortion. As a result, the case gradually shifts in its conceptual focus away from identifying a single responsible individual. Investigators begin to recognize that traditional suspect-based reasoning depends on stable chains of evidence that are not present here. Without that structure, the investigation loses its ability to confidently assign direct accountability or direction. Instead, attention turns toward a more fundamental and unresolved question about what actually occurred during the final confirmed window of Mekayla's presence. This shift reflects a broader collapse of certainty within the case, where fragmented data forces investigators to reconstruct events through patterns rather than direct evidence, leaving interpretation open and unstable. At the same time, attention turns toward her psychological state prior to disappearance. Analysts examine whether emotional stress or developmental pressure may have influenced her behavior. Adolescence is a period where emotional intensity can alter perception of available choices, sometimes without external visibility. Some indicators suggest she may have been seeking forms of connection outside her immediate environment. This is not unusual for teenagers navigating identity formation, but in investigative contexts, it becomes relevant when reconstructing behavioral pathways. Still, no evidence confirms any planned departure from her life. Her psychological profile remains incomplete, composed of partial observations rather than consistent documentation. This incompleteness is important because it highlights how missing persons cases often rely on inference rather than direct insight. The internal experience of the individual becomes inaccessible once physical presence is lost. As time progresses, the case begins to stabilize into unresolved status. There are no major breakthroughs, but there are also no conclusive contradictions that eliminate core possibilities. Instead, the investigation enters a state of suspended uncertainty where new information is scarce and existing information resists synthesis. Years later, advances in data analysis and renewed review of case materials introduce small but significant shifts in interpretation. Certain details that were initially considered minor are reassessed under improved analytical frameworks. This does not produce resolution, but it alters the weight of specific elements within the timeline. Despite these reevaluations, no definitive breakthrough emerges. No single piece of evidence reconfigures the entire case or provides a direct path toward resolution. The investigative structure remains open-ended, with conclusions repeatedly deferred rather than reached. What remains most significant is not what has been discovered, but what has not. The absence of closure becomes its own form of persistence. In the case of Mekayla Bali, time does not resolve uncertainty. It only expands it, leaving the truth suspended in a state that resists final interpretation. In every unresolved disappearance, the absence of answers does not create silence. It creates competing interpretations that grow louder over time. The case of Mekayla Bali has reached that stage, where facts no longer move forward, but theories begin to occupy the space left behind by certainty. At the center of this case are two dominant interpretations that investigators, analysts, and the public continue to revisit. The first suggests internal conflict, a psychological or emotional rupture that led to voluntary disappearance. The second suggests external intervention, the presence of an unknown individual who exploited timing, environment, and opportunity in a way that left no clear trace. The internal conflict theory rests on a familiar psychological framework. Adolescence is a period where emotional intensity can distort long-term judgment. Under pressure, some individuals may seek escape not as a planned decision, but as an impulsive response to perceived emotional overload. In this interpretation, disappearance is not forced, but self-initiated. However, this theory faces limitations because there is no confirmed behavioral sequence indicating preparation for permanent disappearance. There are no verified actions that clearly establish intent to leave life behind or sever all connections. Instead, the timeline remains fragmented, making intent difficult to reconstruct with confidence. The alternative theory introduces the possibility of external involvement. In this scenario, an unknown individual enters the environment at a critical moment and takes advantage of reduced visibility and fragmented attention. Public spaces like shopping centers create conditions where anonymity is structurally built into the environment itself. What makes this theory difficult to dismiss is not evidence of a specific perpetrator, but the nature of the disappearance itself. The absence of struggle, combined with the lack of immediate alarm, suggests either extreme subtlety or extreme trust in the final observed interactions. Both possibilities carry very different psychological implications. From a behavioral analysis perspective, if external involvement did occur, it would imply a significant level of environmental awareness and situational control. Navigating a public space without immediately triggering attention suggests an understanding of crowd flow, surveillance blind spots, and human attention patterns, where observation is often fragmented rather than continuous. This kind of movement does not identify a specific individual, but it does describe a behavioral profile characterized by adaptive awareness and timing sensitivity. It suggests the ability to anticipate how people scan environments, how cameras capture partial angles, and how routine public behavior creates predictable gaps that can be exploited without immediate detection or resistance. At the same time, the victim's final movements must also be examined through a psychological lens. Adolescents under emotional or social pressure may misinterpret trust cues or underestimate risk in environments that feel familiar. Vulnerability in such contexts is often situational rather than constant, shaped by momentary perception rather than long-term behavior. This creates a critical investigative gap. Whether the outcome resulted from internal decision or external influence, both interpretations rely on conditions that are partially invisible. This is what investigators often refer to as a psychological blind zone, where behavior occurs without sufficient observational coverage to confirm intent. The absence of complete surveillance coverage during the critical time window intensifies this uncertainty. When visual confirmation is missing, reconstruction depends on indirect indicators. In Mekayla's case, those indicators are insufficient to produce a single, unified explanation. From a psychological standpoint, the most unsettling aspect is not what is known, but what is structurally unknowable. The final moments exist at the intersection of visibility and invisibility, where presence transitions into absence without a clearly documented threshold. This is where theory replaces certainty. Looking beyond operational analysis, the case also invites broader philosophical reflection. From an Eastern perspective, actions are never truly erased. Every event leaves traces within a larger causal structure, even if those traces are not immediately visible to human perception. In this view, absence is not disappearance, but transformation. From a Western philosophical lens, the case reflects the darker complexity of human nature. It highlights how ordinary environments can contain extraordinary risk, not because of inherent chaos, but because of hidden capacity for harm within predictable systems. Safety, in this interpretation, is always conditional rather than absolute. Both perspectives converge on a shared realization. Truth, even when obscure, does not cease to exist. It may become inaccessible, fragmented, or delayed, but it remains structurally embedded within the event itself. The challenge lies in the limits of human perception, not the absence of reality. In the case of Mekayla Bali, the tension between perception and reality remains unresolved, shaped by incomplete timelines and fragmented witness accounts. Each reconstructed narrative attempts to impose structure on uncertainty, yet the absence of critical data prevents any version from becoming fully stable or definitive in interpretation. As a result, the case continues to exist in a suspended state between explanation and mystery. Every theory offers partial clarity, but none can close the informational gaps left behind. The investigation therefore remains open-ended, defined more by what is missing than by what can be conclusively established. Her name has become associated not only with disappearance, but with persistence of uncertainty. Over time, the case has moved beyond the question of what happened and entered the domain of what can never be fully confirmed. This shift is what defines unresolved investigations at their deepest level. For her family, the absence of closure is not theoretical. It is lived experience, shaped by time that does not resolve ambiguity but preserves it. For investigators and the public, the case remains a point of reflection on the limits of evidence, memory, and reconstruction. And so the case remains open in the only way that truly matters, not in files or reports, but in unanswered questions that continue to exist without resolution. Mekayla Bali becomes not just a missing person, but a reminder of how fragile certainty can be when time removes the possibility of confirmation. Some crimes leave no screams, only questions, and some silences echo louder than any confession. Thank you for listening to Criminal Mindcast.